Hello to everyone listening from around the world. Today's account comes from Frank Holloway, 52, who shared what happened when his wife served him divorce papers in his workplace break room, with his boss standing right behind her, grinning like the outcome had already been decided. This account has been dramatized to protect privacy. AI narration is used throughout. The experience it describes is real. Grab a snack, pour a glass of wine, and enjoy the story. The vending machine took my $4 and gave me nothing back. That's the detail I keep coming back to. Not the fluorescent light above Bay 3 that had been flickering for 6 weeks because Craig Denton wouldn't sign off on a maintenance request. Not the smell of diesel exhaust and industrial cleaner baked into the break room walls so deep you stopped noticing it after the first month. Not the fact that my steel-toed boots had soaked through somewhere around hour 7 of a 9-hour shift and my lower back had been filing formal complaints since noon. It was the machine. $4. Gone. A blinking error code where a sandwich should have been. That's your day in one transaction, Frank. $4 and nothing to show for it. I was standing there staring at that error code, trying to decide if I had the energy to find the building manager and ask for my money back, when the break room door opened behind me. I heard the heels first, the specific sharp rhythm of expensive shoes on cheap linoleum. Sandra didn't own shoes like that 3 months ago. I knew every pair she owned, knew them by the sound they made and where she kept them, and how much they'd cost and which ones she'd bought on sale at the DSW on Kenwood Road. The shoes I heard crossing the break room floor did not belong to that inventory. I turned around slowly. She was wearing a gray blazer I didn't recognize, hair done the way she did it for events, not for Tuesdays. The manila envelope in her left hand was thick. Her face was the specific kind of calm that isn't peaceful at all. It's the calm of a decision that's already been made and rehearsed and committed to. The calm of a woman who had been preparing for this moment for longer than I'd known it was coming. She didn't come alone, behind her one hand braced against the break room door frame like he was posing for a magazine cover, was Craig Denton. Craig ran operations for Harwick Distribution, the company I'd worked for going on 11 years. He was 51, well-dressed in that particular way that communicates money without tipping into taste, and he had spent 3 years giving me the kind of management that felt less like leadership and more like sustained low-grade humiliation. The passive credit stealing, the strategic exclusion from meetings where decisions got made about work I'd produced. The buddy delivered in that particular tone that means nothing and somehow still lands like something. 3 years of that. 3 years of telling myself patience was a strategy. He was standing in my break room, behind my wife, smiling. Don't do anything loud, not here, not now. Sandra slid the envelope across the break room table the way you'd push a receipt toward a cashier. Frank, her voice was even. We need to do this today. I looked at the envelope. I looked back at her. Do what? She folded her arms. Don't make it harder than it has to be. I opened the envelope. Petition for dissolution of marriage. My full name at the top. The county seal. A date. The date was 2 weeks ago. She'd been carrying this for 2 weeks. The break room had gone very quiet. 2 of my coworkers near the coffee station had developed a sudden urgent interest in their phones. Pete Akers, who'd worked the loading bay with me for 6 years and was the closest thing I had to a work friend, was staring at the floor tiles with the focused concentration of a man trying to physically remove himself from a situation without moving his feet. Craig hadn't moved from the doorframe. You're doing this here, I said. Not a question. I needed you to actually receive it. Sandra glanced at Craig briefly, then back. You have a habit of avoiding things you don't want to deal with. There it is. I want to know when this started. I kept my voice level. Low. The way you talk when you know raising it will be used against you. This isn't about that. Then what's it about, Sandra? She exhaled. Slowly, like she'd practiced the exhale too. It's about the fact that you work 70 hours a week and we still can't take a real vacation. It's about the fact that every conversation about money ends with you telling me to be patient. It's about the fact that I am 47 years old and I am still waiting for the life I was supposed to have. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the edges of it. I'm done waiting, Frank. Craig pushed off the doorframe, smoothed his jacket, said absolutely nothing, which was somehow the loudest thing in the room. You're leaving me for him. Not a question. She didn't flinch. Not a single muscle in her face moved. I'm leaving because I deserve more than this. She practiced that one too. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I looked at Craig. He met my eyes with that particular expression he used in meetings when he knew something you didn't. A studied neutrality that was really just confidence wearing a mask, like he'd already run the numbers and liked his position. I looked back down at the petition, and then I did the last thing either of them expected. I picked up a pen from the table, flipped to the signature page, and I signed it. Sandra blinked. That caught her off guard. She'd been ready for a scene. She'd brought Craig as a witness and maybe a buffer and maybe, if I'm being honest, as a statement. She wasn't ready for me to just sign it. Quietly, without theatrics. I slid it back across the table. Have your attorney file it whenever you're ready. I walked to the vending machine, pressed the coin return one more time on the outside chance it would give me my $4 back. It didn't. I picked up my bag from the bench by the lockers. Frank, Sandra started. I hope you got what you wanted. I looked at Craig one last time. Both of you. I walked out of the break room. Through the warehouse floor. Past the flickering light above Bay 3. Out through the loading dock. Into the parking lot, where the October air hit my face cold and clean and completely indifferent to everything that had just happened. I sat in my truck for 11 minutes. I know, because I watched the clock. You knew. Somewhere you knew. You just didn't want to be right. I drove home to the house on Glenway Avenue in Cincinnati's West Price Hill neighborhood that we'd lived in for 16 years. A 2-story colonial with a covered porch and a furnace that needed to be replaced, and a backyard Sandra had always wanted to put a deck on, and never quite got around to because there was always something more urgent eating the savings account. The house was quiet in the way houses go quiet when half of someone's life has been removed from them. Her closet was 2/3 empty. The bathroom shelf on her side was cleared down to the tile, except for a cracked bottle of hand lotion she'd always complained about, and a single black elastic hair tie she'd forgotten. The kind that sells in a bag of 50 for $2. The only thing she'd left behind that hadn't been part of the plan. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. I stared at a stack of unopened mail I'd been ignoring for the better part of 3 weeks. And then, because I had nowhere to be and nothing left to lose and $4 that a machine had stolen from me and no patience left for any of it, I opened the mail. Bills. A water notice. A dental reminder. A credit card statement I was not emotionally prepared for. And then, near the bottom of the stack, a thick cream-colored envelope, heavy paper, my full legal name printed across the front in a serif font that looked like it charged by the letter. Frank Raymond Holloway. A name I almost never used. A name that lived on my birth certificate and my military discharge papers, and nowhere else. The return address was a law firm downtown, High Street, Fountain Square District, the kind of address that meant money and decisions made in rooms with views. Probably debt, something my mother left behind that nobody ever tracked down. I almost threw it in the recycling pile. I almost stacked it under the water bill and dealt with it later, the way I dealt with everything I didn't have the bandwidth for. I don't know why I opened it. Habit, maybe. Or the particular exhaustion of a day that had already taken everything it could take and left me with nothing to protect. The letter was from an attorney named Gerald Marsh. 3 paragraphs. Formal language. A request that I contact the firm at my earliest convenience regarding the estate of Raymond Dale Holloway, my uncle, a man I had met exactly once, at my mother's funeral, 22 years ago. Dark suit. Firm handshake. He'd pressed a business card into my palm and an envelope into my jacket pocket, and said with the specific brevity of someone who communicates in outcomes rather than words, "Use this well." The envelope had contained $5,000 in cash and a note with no explanation. Then nothing. For 22 years, nothing. He's dead. And apparently he remembered me. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay in a bed that felt architecturally wrong now that it was only occupied on one side, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about a man I barely knew who had handed me $5,000 at my mother's graveside, and then vanished for 2 decades. I called Gerald Marsh's office the next morning at 8:15. He answered himself. "Mr. Holloway," he said, "thank you for calling. Can you come in?" "When?" "Today, if possible." Something in the way he said it. "I can be there by 10. I said, "If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So, thank you. For real. Gerald Marsh's office was on the 14th floor of a building on East 5th Street, 2 blocks from Fountain Square, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Ohio River. On a clear day, the kind of office that exists to communicate before anyone says a single word, that the people who work inside it are not impressed by much. The receptionist offered me coffee before I finished giving my name. Real coffee, not the burned pot institutional variety I'd been drinking off a warehouse hot plate for 11 years. Gerald Marsh stood when I entered the conference room. Actually stood, not the cursory half-rise that people do in meetings when they're not sure how important you are. He stood the way you stand for someone whose time you respect. He was 60-something, silver-haired, the kind of attorney who had spent enough decades in rooms full of complicated money that he'd developed the specific calm of someone who doesn't startle easily. "Mr. Holloway," he extended his hand. "Please, sit." I sat, still in my Carhartt jacket, still faintly smelling of diesel and industrial cleaner because I hadn't gone home to change. I felt the distance between myself and the leather chair and the walnut paneling, and the untouched water glass in front of me, and I let it sit there without trying to close it. "Your uncle passed away approximately 3 weeks ago," Gerald said. "Raymond Dale Holloway. He was 78. I barely knew him," I said. "He knew enough about you." Gerald slid a folder across the table. I opened it. Account summaries, trust documents, equity schedules, pages of numbers arranged in columns that my eyes kept sliding off of because they were too large to hold the right shape in my head. "Your uncle spent 40 years building a private investment portfolio," Gerald said. His voice was even and unhurried, the way you speak when you've delivered information like this before, and you've learned that pace matters more than volume. "Early technology acquisitions, industrial real estate, board-level equity positions in several mid-size holding companies." He paused. At the time of his death, the estate was valued at approximately $470 million. I put the folder down. Not dramatically, not with any particular weight. I just set it on the table and looked at the man across from me. "There's a mistake." "There isn't." Gerald's expression didn't change. "You are his sole heir, Mr. Holloway. He had no children, no surviving spouse. He made his intentions clear in documents executed 14 years ago and updated twice since. You were always the beneficiary." $470 million. Yesterday morning I'd been rationing myself to 1 meal per shift to avoid touching the savings account. Yesterday afternoon my wife had handed me divorce papers in a break room while my boss stood behind her like a prop in someone else's story. And now a stranger in a tailored suit was telling me I had inherited more money than I could spend in 4 lifetimes. I sat very still. "Say something. I need you to walk me through the assets," I said finally. "All of them." Gerald nodded, like that was exactly the right response. He pulled a second folder from the stack. "Among the inherited holdings," he said, turning to a specific page and sliding it toward me, "is a controlling equity stake." He tapped the document. "In the parent company of Harwick Distribution." I looked at the name on the page, Harwick Group Holdings. I knew that name. Every employee at Harwick Distribution knew that name in the same vague, theoretical way you know the name of the country that makes your phone. It existed somewhere above you, abstract and irrelevant to the actual work you did every day. It was the holding company, the entity at the top of the organizational chart that nobody in the warehouse ever thought about, because it was too far removed from anything that actually touched your day. The entity that owned the building I worked in. The entity that Craig Denton's entire career was built on. The entity that, according to the document in front of me, now belonged to Frank Raymond Holloway. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Gerald waited. He was good at waiting. "How controlling?" I said. 63%. 63%. I thought about Craig Denton in that doorframe. That particular smile. The expensive jacket draped just right. 3 years of Buddy delivered in a tone that meant nothing. Sandra had left a warehouse worker. She had no idea she'd just walked out on the man who owned everything her new partner had ever stood on. I closed the folder. "Gerald," I said, "I'm going to need 90 days. The first thing I did was nothing. That surprises people when I tell them they want the story to move immediately. They want the moment of discovery to launch directly into action, into confrontation, into the satisfying machinery of a reversal set in motion. And I understand that impulse. I felt it too, sitting in Gerald's conference room with the folder closed in front of me and the Ohio River visible through the window. and my entire life rearranged into a shape I didn't have a name for yet. But I'd spent 11 years learning what happened when men like Craig Denton acted fast. They made noise. They left traces. They confused urgency with power and speed with intelligence. And then they spent the next 3 months cleaning up the wreckage of their own momentum. I was not going to make that mistake. You have 63% of everything he has ever built. You can afford to be patient. I drove home to Glenway Avenue. I made dinner. Eggs and toast, the bachelor default meal I'd already started circling back to. And I sat at the kitchen table and I thought, not about Sandra, not about Craig, not about the number in that folder which still felt like a figure from a country I'd never visited. I thought about my uncle, Raymond Dale Holloway, a man who had shown up at my mother's funeral in a dark suit, pressed a handful of cash into my hands, and then disappeared for 22 years without explanation. I had spent exactly 0 emotional energy on him in the interim. You don't grieve what you never had, but sitting at that kitchen table in a half-empty house, I found myself wondering what he'd been watching all that time, whether he'd been watching at all. He knew enough about you. That's what Gerald had said, and I kept turning it over. Because what exactly had Raymond known? He'd seen me at a funeral when I was 30. He'd sent $5,000 and a note with no explanation, and then apparently he'd spent 14 years making legal arrangements to hand me his entire estate. What does a man see in another man that makes him certain, across decades and distance and silence? I didn't have an answer, but I thought about it for a long time in the quiet of a house that had gotten very honest very quickly. The next morning, I went back to work. Pete Akers met me at the locker room door with the expression of a man who had witnessed a natural disaster and wasn't sure if the survivor wanted to discuss it. "Frank," he clapped me on the shoulder. "You don't have to be here. I know. Craig's been..." He stopped, recalibrated. "The vibe in there is weird." "When isn't it?" I worked my shift. I answered emails. I processed inventory. I interacted with Craig Denton in exactly the same way I always had, with the measured, professional neutrality of a man who knew his place in the organizational structure and accepted it without complaint. Craig didn't avoid me. He was too confident for avoidance. He gave me the same half-smile he always gave me, and once, passing in the corridor outside the loading bay, he squeezed my shoulder in a gesture that was meant to communicate sympathy, but actually communicated something closer to triumph. "Keep smiling, Craig. You've got 90 days left of this." I called Gerald from the parking lot that evening. "I want the full audit. The full audit of the Harwick Holdings? All of it. Every division, every contract, every vendor relationship, every board resolution going back 5 years. I want the physical facilities inspected, the HR records reviewed, the safety compliance documentation pulled." A pause. "That's a significant undertaking." "I know. Start Monday." The audit was conducted through an independent firm Gerald retained. They operated quietly at the holding company level, which meant the operational teams, including Craig Denton, had no mechanism for knowing it was happening. From Craig's perspective, the quarterly review processes continued as normal. From mine, I was reading sworn financial statements every evening at the kitchen table that was beginning to collect a second purpose. What we found was not surprising. That was the thing that stayed with me as the weeks accumulated. None of it was surprising. Craig Denton had been running Harwick Distribution the way a certain kind of man runs things when he believes no one with real authority will ever look his direction. Vendor contracts awarded to companies with interesting ownership structures. Safety compliance reports that had been massaged in the direction of acceptability. Injury documentation that had been delayed, reduced, or in 3 cases not filed at all. HR settlements, 4 of them in 5 years, that had been buried in operational expense lines with no board disclosure. Executive bonus structures that had been quietly adjusted upward while budget requests from the warehouse floor, including Pete Akers' 3-year request for replacement safety harnesses, had been denied. I thought about Pete when I read that one. 6 years working alongside that man. 6 years of watching him do his job, with the kind of quiet competence that never gets noticed because it never fails. 3 years of submitted requests for basic safety equipment denied each time without explanation, while the executive bonus line grew by 11% annually. That one's personal. Craig. That one specifically. Sandra called on a Thursday evening in week 4. I was at the kitchen table with audit documents spread across half the surface. I let it ring 4 times before I picked up. Frank. Her voice had a careful quality. Measured. She'd been thinking about what to say. I wanted to check that you're okay. I'm fine, Sandra. I know things happened fast, and A pause. I didn't want to be cruel. Didn't want to be cruel. She brought him to my workplace. I'm genuinely fine, I said. How are you? She seemed unprepared for the question. There was a brief silence in which I could hear her recalibrating. I'm good. Things are good. I'm glad. Are you still at the house? For now. Longer this time. You seem different. Do I? Calm. You were always, before, you were always carrying something. You seem lighter. I am lighter. Or I will be. Give it 60 days. I've had some time to think, I said. That's all. She said she'd have her attorney reach out about the house. I said that was fine. I wished her well and I meant it without any warmth. And I hung up the phone and went back to the audit documents. Before I tell you what happened in that boardroom, drop a comment right now and tell me, what would you have done with 63%? And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it. Because this is where it changes. By week 7, the picture was complete. Gerald presented the findings in a 3-hour meeting that I attended in the same conference room where I'd first learned about the inheritance. Except this time, I sat at the head of the table rather than halfway down it. 12 categories of documented concern. 11 sworn affidavits from current and former employees who had been waiting for someone in a position of actual authority to finally look their direction. Civil exposure is significant, Gerald said. Criminal referral is possible on the OSHA violations, depending on prosecutorial discretion. The financial irregularities are documented and provable. The harassment settlements represent a separate liability. What's his position? I asked. Callahan? Gerald considered. He's confident. He has no reason not to be. As far as he knows, the ownership structure hasn't changed, and this is a routine quarterly review. Make sure it stays that way. I straightened the folder in front of me. I want the board meeting scheduled as an ownership transition and strategic review, standard language. Nothing in the notice that changes his preparation. Understood. And Gerald. I looked at him directly. I want the safety harness purchase order for the warehouse floor approved, before the meeting. Out of the estate accounts if necessary. They've been waiting 3 years for basic equipment. Gerald wrote something on his legal pad, didn't comment on it. That was one of the things I appreciated about him. He didn't editorialize. I drove to Pete's house that evening. He lived 12 minutes from me in Cheviot, in a ranch house with a basketball hoop in the driveway that his youngest had outgrown but nobody had gotten around to taking down. I knocked on the door at 7:15. He answered in a Bengals sweatshirt, holding a beer, looking at me the way you look at someone who has shown up unexpected but not unwelcome. Frank. He stepped back to let me in. What's going on? I need to tell you something. His wife Carol brought coffee without being asked, and then quietly left the room with the particular grace of a woman who understands when her husband needs the space. I told Pete everything. Not all of it, not the specific numbers, not the full scope of what I'd inherited, but enough. Enough for him to understand that his safety harness request had been found and documented and approved. Enough for him to understand that things at Harwick were about to change in ways he couldn't yet see but could trust were coming. He sat with it for a long moment. You're telling me, he said slowly, that your uncle left you the company, the parent company. Yes. And Craig. Pete looked at his coffee mug, then back at me. When? 3 days. He nodded once, the kind of nod that doesn't need anything added to it. The harnesses, he said. Already ordered. He exhaled through his nose. Something that wasn't quite a laugh. 3 years, Frank. I know. 3 years of paperwork and he kept saying the budget. I know. We sat in the quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed on the street. The basketball hoop swayed faintly in the wind. You're not going to do anything loud in there, Pete said. Not a question. No. He nodded again. Good. Men like Craig, they want loud. They know how to handle loud. He looked at me steadily. Quiet is what scares them. I drove home through the Cincinnati streets at 8 in the evening, November now, the trees stripped and the city lit amber in the early dark. I had 2 days left. I pressed my suit, not my work clothes. The gray suit I'd bought 6 years ago for Kevin Akers' christening, and worn twice since. Once to a funeral, and once to a charity dinner Sandra had wanted to attend. I'd had it cleaned and pressed at the dry cleaner on Harrison Avenue and picked it up that afternoon and hung it on the back of the bedroom door, and I looked at it for a while before I turned the lights off. Tomorrow. I slept better than I had any right to. It rained the morning of the board meeting, not soft rain, the particular driving November rain that comes off Lake Erie and moves down through Ohio with the specific intent of making everything gray and honest. The kind of weather that strips away whatever version of yourself you were maintaining and leaves only what's actually underneath. I stood at the bathroom mirror at 6:15 in the morning and looked at the face of a man who had worked 11 years in a warehouse and spent 90 days preparing to walk into a room he had every legal right to enter. And I felt something I didn't have a precise name for. Not excitement, not anger, something quieter and more complete than either. The specific internal stillness that comes when you have finished preparing, and the only thing left is to begin. I put on the gray suit. I drove downtown. I found parking on 4th Street and walked the 2 blocks to the Harwick Group Holdings corporate offices in the rain without an umbrella, because I hadn't thought to bring one and I wasn't going back for it. I arrived at the front entrance with damp shoulders and completely dry hands, which seemed right. The lobby security guard checked my name against a list and found it, printed across the top, under the date and the meeting title, Ownership, Transition, and Strategic Review. He issued me a visitor badge, then looked at it again, then looked at my name again, and something shifted in his expression. Not recognition exactly, more the dawning awareness that the word on the badge and the meeting title and the floor he was sending me to added up to something he hadn't been briefed on. Good morning, I told him. Have a good one. The boardroom was on the 18th floor. Glass walls on 2 sides, city views partially obscured by the rain, a long polished table with 12 seats around it and additional chairs along the wall for the supporting cast, executives, assistants, legal counsel who attended because their presence was expected rather than required, water glasses at every seat. Nobody had touched theirs yet. I was the last to arrive. I didn't walk fast. I didn't announce myself from the doorway. I simply entered the room the way you enter a room that belongs to you, with the unhurried certainty of a man who isn't trying to make an entrance because he doesn't need to. I saw Craig before he saw me. He was seated about 2/3 down the table, phone face down in front of him, jacket draped with deliberate casualness across the back of his chair. He was talking to the executive to his left, something low and confident, whatever executives say to each other before meetings begin, the small performances of authority. His posture said, I belong here. His expression said, this is routine. Then his peripheral vision caught me. He turned. Full recognition took about 2 seconds. First the glance, the automatic dismissive sweep he gave everyone who walked through a door, the neural shortcut of a man who had long ago sorted the world into people worth his attention and people who weren't. Then the correction, the double take that wasn't quite a double take, the fraction of a second recalibration where his brain said, that's the warehouse floor supervisor, why is he? And then further still, why is he wearing a suit? Why is Gerald Marsh standing behind him? Why is he walking toward the head of the color changed in his face. Not dramatically, just a subtle shift, like a light source had been adjusted somewhere. Gerald closed the door. Ladies and gentlemen, Gerald said, with the particular measured cadence of a man who has spent 40 years making consequential statements in formal rooms. Thank you for coming this morning. I'd like to formally introduce Frank Raymond Holloway, sole heir to the estate of Raymond Dale Holloway and majority controlling shareholder of Harwick Group Holdings. A brief pause. Effective today, your new chairman. The silence that followed was not polite silence. It was the specific silence of a room full of people who were each individually computing the same information and arriving at the same conclusion and trying to determine whether their face was giving anything away. Craig pushed back from his chair. Not all the way, just enough to indicate the impulse. That's not possible. His voice was level, but I could hear the foundation of it. He works for me. He's a floor supervisor. I did work for you, I said, walking to the head of the table. Please sit down, Craig. He sat, slowly, the way a man sits when sitting is the only option left, and he knows it. I settled into the chair at the head of the table. I opened the folder Gerald had placed there. I took a moment, not for effect, genuinely, to look around the room at 12 board members and the assembled executive team and the assistants near the back wall, and all the untouched water glasses. And I thought about a break room on a Monday afternoon and $4 in a vending machine that gave nothing back. Here we go. Over the past 90 days, I said, I authorized a full internal audit of every operational division under Harwick Group Holdings. I want to be direct about what we found, because I think directness is the only thing that serves everyone in this room. I clicked the remote. The first slide appeared on the screen at the end of the room. Harwick Distribution, the operational subsidiary most of you know best, is by a considerable margin the most significantly compromised entity in this portfolio. The first slide was vendor contracts, clean charts, specific numbers, ownership trails documented to their conclusion. I walked through it without editorializing. Facts had their own momentum if you gave them room to move. The second slide was safety compliance, the OSHA documentation, the 3 injury incidents that had not been properly reported, the timeline of those incidents relative to the timeline of the executive bonus adjustments. By the third slide, nobody in the room was performing normalcy anymore. Craig's jaw was set. He was running calculations behind his eyes. I could see it, the rapid internal assessment of what I had, how much I could prove, what his exit options were. He had the look of a man who had never genuinely believed this day was possible, and was now having to integrate its arrival in real time. These numbers are being misrepresented, he said sharply during the third slide. You don't understand the operational complexity. I understand enough, I said, without raising my voice, to know that you approved a personal compensation adjustment of $42,000 11 days after you denied a replacement safety harness order for the warehouse floor team. A harness order that had been submitted annually for 3 consecutive years. I let that sit for a moment. Pete Akers submitted that request the first time in October of 2021. You denied it each time as a budget concern. The room was completely still. I kept going. Sworn testimony from 6 former employees. Bank records. Contract trails with documented conflicts of interest. HR suppression memos. Actual memos, written in Craig's own email account, advising the HR director on how to minimize the footprint of 3 separate settlement agreements. Names, dates, dollar amounts, signatures. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't need to. Evidence properly organized and patiently delivered doesn't need volume. When I closed the final folder, the room felt different than it had when I'd opened it. Like something structural had shifted and everyone was quietly recalibrating how much weight they'd been trusting it to hold. Craig. I looked at him directly. Your employment with Harwick Group Holdings is terminated, effective immediately for cause. You are barred from all company premises. Your access credentials will be revoked as of the close of this meeting. Severance is denied per the cause provisions of your employment agreement, and this matter is being referred to our legal counsel for assessment of civil and potential criminal liability. He stood up so fast his chair rolled back and hit the wall. This is personal. His voice had lost its management tone. It was just a voice now. This is about your wife. This is revenge. I looked at him. No, I said. This is what accountability looks like when the right person finally has the authority to require it. I glanced toward the door. Security is outside. He left, not gracefully, but he left. The board meeting concluded 90 minutes later with a unanimous resolution formalizing the ownership transition and authorizing a full operational review of all Harwick subsidiaries. Gerald handled the procedural elements with the efficiency of someone who had prepared for every contingency. I rode the elevator down alone. The lobby was quiet. The rain had stopped at some point during the meeting. I hadn't noticed when. The city outside the glass doors was wet and clean and going about its business with complete indifference to everything that had just happened on the 18th floor. I walked out through the front entrance. Sandra called at 11:40. I was in Gerald's office reviewing the immediate operational priorities when my phone lit up on the table. I looked at her name for a moment. Then I picked up. No greeting, just breathing. Unsteady. What did you do? My job. Don't do that. Craig called me. He said you had him escorted out. He said you humiliated him in front of the entire board. Her voice was rising. Frank, what is going on? Craig was terminated for cause, I said. It's documented. It was a long time coming. This is because of me. Not a question. Sandra, I kept my voice even. Craig Denton approved personal bonuses while denying safety equipment to warehouse workers who submitted requests for 3 consecutive years. He buried harassment settlements. He manipulated vendor contracts for personal benefit. Those aren't things I invented because you left me. They're things that happened while someone with the authority to stop them was looking the other direction. I paused. Your leaving me just happened to clarify who I was looking at. A silence. Long enough that I thought she might have hung up. You own the company. Her voice had changed. The accusation had drained out of it and left something rawer underneath. The parent company. Yes. How long have you? 3 months. Another silence. You could have warned us. Softer now. Still us. Even now, standing in the wreckage of everything, she still spoke in a plural that included a man who was currently being legally reviewed for fraud. I owed the employees a fair process, I said. I owed the company its integrity. I didn't owe either of you anything I wasn't legally required to provide. She didn't respond. I heard her breathing change. Then the call ended. The months that followed moved at the unhurried pace of consequences. Without Craig's salary and the infrastructure it had been supporting, the lifestyle he and Sandra had constructed together began its quiet contraction almost immediately. The mortgage on the house they'd rented became difficult within 6 weeks. The civil claims from former employees, once it became clear that Craig had no institutional protection left, began arriving with regularity. His industry contacts went quiet. Men like Craig cultivate loyalty based on proximity to power, and once the power is gone, the loyalty tends to review its position. I heard from Pete Akers that the replacement safety harnesses arrived at the warehouse the week after the board meeting. He texted me a photo of them stacked in the equipment room. 14 sets. Clean and orange and completely unremarkable the way basic safety equipment should be. That photo stayed in my phone longer than anything else from that period. Sandra called once more, about 6 weeks after the board meeting. I was sitting on the covered porch of the Glenway Avenue house, drinking coffee in the early evening, watching the neighborhood go through the motions of a Tuesday in December. She called and I picked up, because there was nothing left that call could do to me. I made a mistake, she said quietly, without the prepared quality of the previous calls, just the exhausted honesty of someone who had run out of alternative explanations. I let the silence sit between us for a moment. Some things deserve room. You didn't make a mistake, I said. You made a choice. Everything that followed is just the shape that choice took. She didn't respond. I heard her breathing, then nothing. I set the phone on the arm of the porch chair and watched a car pull into a driveway 3 houses down. A woman got out with grocery bags. A dog appeared at the front door. Ordinary Tuesday evening on an ordinary street. This is what the other side of it looks like. Not triumph, just Tuesday. I've thought about what I would tell someone else in that break room, standing at the machine that just took their money and gave them nothing, watching the door open and the life they thought they had walk in wearing shoes they don't recognize. Here is what I would tell them. The thing that nearly destroyed me wasn't the divorce. It wasn't Craig standing in that doorway. It wasn't 11 years of overtime and patience and strategic deferral that nobody above me ever noticed or rewarded. It was the story I'd been telling myself about what those things meant. That quiet equals invisible. That patience equals powerlessness. That the man who doesn't make noise in a break room has nothing left to say. That story was wrong. Power isn't volume. It isn't the man in the expensive jacket standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and his expression rehearsed. Real power, the durable kind, the kind that doesn't require an audience, is the ability to wait until the room is right and then walk to the head of the table without breaking stride. I didn't become powerful when I signed those inheritance documents. I became powerful when I decided standing in that parking lot, with 11 minutes on the dashboard clock and nothing left to lose, that I wasn't going to respond to that break room with noise. What Craig Denton never understood about men like me, men who work 9-hour shifts in steel-toed boots and process inventory reports and sign for $4 sandwiches from machines that steal their money, is that we are not invisible because we are powerless. We're invisible because we're patient, and patience, when it finally moves, doesn't announce itself. It just shows up at the head of the table, already seated, already decided, wondering, calmly, why it took this long for everyone else to catch up. Sandra handed me divorce papers like I was the end of something. What she didn't know was that she'd handed them to a man who already owned everything she thought she was running toward. She found out eventually. By then, I was already somewhere else. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more family-centered account like this.